Good evening and welcome, everyone. Thank you for tuning in tonight. My name is Kate Bruns, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am so pleased to introduce tonight's talk with Ravi Shankar, presenting his memoir, Correctional, joined in conversation by Vijay Seshadri. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our ever-expanding community. We host virtual events like tonight's at least 5 times a week. You can find our event schedule on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can sign up for our email newsletter or browse our bookshelves from home. This evening's event is going to conclude with some time for your questions. If you would like to ask the authors something, please go to the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen where you can submit your question. We're going to get through as many as time allows for. Also, if you would like closed captions, I will be enabling those, and you can just click the live transcript tab on your Zoom screen. In just a moment, I will post the link to purchase tonight's featured book, Correctional, in the chat box. Your book purchases make virtual author events like this possible, and they support the future of a landmark indie bookstore. So thank you for tuning in tonight. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you have likely experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues can arise. And if they do, I'm going to do my best to resolve them quickly. So thank you for your patience and your understanding. And now I am so pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Author, translator, and professor Ravi Shankar has written and edited over 15 books and chapbooks of poetry. The winner of a Pushcart Prize, some of his collections of poetry include Instrumentality, the collaborative chapbook Wanton Textiles with Reb Livingston, Deepening Groove, Language for a New Century, and The Many Uses of Mint. Ravi is also the founding editor and executive director of the online arts journal Drunken Boat, one of the oldest electronic arts journals on the web. He currently teaches for the New York Writers Workshop. Tonight, he's joined in conversation by Vijay Seshadri, a Pulitzer Prize winning poet whose books include Wild Kingdom, The Long Meadow, The Disappearances, 3 Sections, and most recently, That Was Now, This Is Then. He currently teaches at Sarah Lawrence College. Tonight, the two will discuss Ravi's new memoir, Correctional, a complex portrait of the American criminal justice system and mental health policies that perpetuate inequities. His prose has been called rhapsodic, punchy, profound, and discursively sound. Author H. Bruce Franklin hails Correctional as a real odyssey written with admirable honesty. Quote, Ravi's deep insights into our justice system are alone worth the price of admission. We are so pleased to be hosting this event tonight. So without further ado, Vijay and Ravi, the digital podium is now yours.
Thank you, Kate.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. And thanks to the Harvard Bookstore for hosting us. And this is going to be a very interesting event for me. I was absorbed in the book all week and had so many questions that I'm eager to at least put some of them to Ravi. And the way we're going to do this is that I'm going to talk about what I see as the large themes of the book briefly, which Kate also mentioned, so I don't want to repeat what she said, but what struck me as central to it was that it had a set of overlapping narratives that intertwined with each other in this fascinating way, the center of which was a dramatic event in Ravi's life. And he can tell you more about that event when he starts talking. But he will also introduce the book a little bit and then read from it, and then we will have a back and forth conversation and then open the discussion up to questions from the audience. So Ravi, do you want to start now and tell us what this journey is all about?
Sure. Thank you, Vijay, and thank you to Harvard Bookstore. And I want to thank University of Wisconsin Press and my publicist Lisa Warren and Samuel Hecker for helping put this event together. And it's a little bizarre because, of course, the hard copy is a little bit delayed, but you can pre-order it through Harvard Bookstore and get, I think, a signed book plate. And yes, I mean, this is a book that I never anticipated writing. It's a departure for me, both in terms of genre and also in terms of content. And it is really the story of my parents' immigration from South India to the US, my growing up both in Northern Virginia and moving back to India as a young boy, and then living in New York during 9/11. But as Vijay said, the central crux of the book is these 90 days that I had to do at Hartford Correctional, the circumstances of which I described, but I had violated my probation by driving on a suspended license. And it just so coincided with the time that I was being promoted to full professor at a state university in Connecticut. And so it fomented a lot of outrage and kind of sensationalistic reporting. And really in the aftermath of that, I mean, I really, my marriage was falling apart. I took a wrecking ball to my career, to my life for reasons that I didn't really quite understand. I mean, I was pretty successful to that point, and how did I end up at this place? And the other side of it, I guess, is that once I was there, I was exposed to part of American society that exists today that we're sometimes not fully cognizant of or in denial about, but that affects, and as I say in the book, 3% of Americans are either incarcerated, on parole, on probation. So a fairly large percentage. And that exposure, I mean, knowing all of these figures theoretically was very different than experiencing it firsthand and meeting some of the men whose stories that I share. But maybe just as a way, and this is really great, it's kind of the last leg of this little mini tour. And I kicked things off on the first day by reading the introduction. And I thought maybe I would read today, the final letter. There are these 6 letters in the book, and they form a kind of architectural spine. They're direct addresses to people in my life. And this is the final letter. And I'll also say, and we can kind of talk about this in a structural sense, but each of the letters stands for one of the 6 seasons in India. There are 2 additional seasons, the monsoon and the pre-vernal, which is this last one, which kind of comes before the springtime. And I'll just read this and then we can kind of get going. So this is right at the end of the book. This is called Pinpani, which in Tamil is the pre-vernal season. It has a little epigraph from Emily Dickinson. This is my letter to the world that never wrote to me. Dear creation, I jacked up my life because I once saw God up on a mountaintop with one of my best friends as witness. I felt the ripple of the energy that keeps us connected, harmonizing with my own intent and possible futures. There were deer involved and a thunderstorm, but it's a revelation that will only feel mundane, even in the deployment of the most refined language. It's simply enough that it happened. I was provided that afternoon a destiny to which I failed to measure up, given a family I could have kept intact, if not for my personal menagerie of pig, cock, and snake. That's what I find hardest to forgive myself for, since I'll never know what was down that other diverging road. Instead, I took the one less traveled by, the more painful, self-revealing path, and that has made all the difference. Robert Frost continues to be my American freshman college students' favorite poet, which continually astonishes me because they don't seem to exhibit much in common with his bleak, overdetermined stoicism. I'm always glad to introduce these students to other poets running the gamut from Etheridge Knight and Claudia Rankine to Emily Dickinson and John Keats, whose advice to tell all the truth but tell it slant, or whose concept of negative capability being in uncertainty, mystery, doubt, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason, remains so germane. The world is never quite so monochromatic as we might hope, and the divisions between us are just in our minds. None of us are born wanting to marginalize another human being. Yet when in history an entire economy is fabricated upon the enslavement of others, and some people continue to benefit disproportionately from that fact, we need to point it out, even if it makes us uncomfortable. When we see the outdated Puritan mechanisms of shaming being used, we need to respond with compassion. For Buddhists, shame, if understood properly for what it is an impoverished mentality, the terror of being judged, a state of lacking, the condition of perpetual insufficiency, but a state that can actually become a transformative principle. It can provide a gateway to a larger, more inclusive sense of belonging, help open us up compassionately to others. It shows how empty the egoism with which we invest ourselves really is compared to the vastness of our luminous true nature. In Madras, South India, where my father's family comes from, there's a sing-song taunt that you will hear in the dusty schoolyards. Shame, shame, puppy shame, all the monkeys know your name. The chant means to jeer that you've been found out. You've been exposed bare ass as a newborn cur. The fact that one of the slang connotations of the word puppy in Tamil is penis only adds delectably to the cutting double entendre. This is the kind of phrase my bow-tied adversaries would intone in unison at my convent school when one of the younger students had peed himself in fright after being set upon by bullies wielding tiffin carriers. That nursery rhyme is a way of othering, of making a distinction between a group and an individual, of drawing a line in the sand, of saying, you're there and I'm here with the others. You live on the other side of that border from us. Isn't that what it means when a group or individual is cast beyond the pale? That linguistic phrase for impropriety absorbs connotations as it moves through time. Etymologically, the idiom refers to an archaic definition. The word pale is a region lying within an imposed boundary, like a staked fence, as part of Ireland was for 14th century English administrators. So that going beyond it was doing something literally outside those lines. It began to mean acting bizarrely or slightly abhorrently, literally leaving civilization behind. And yet, when we hear that phrase now, we can't help but see color. Pale face, as in possessing a white complexion, as in conforming and being civilized. Overlay that sense with the act of colonizing a territory or policing the grounds of propriety, and we have a very different signification indeed. Today, it's the prison population that are beyond the pale. Personally, though, I've always been more interested in the shadow, that part of ourselves that we are ashamed of and that we feel guilty about, the part that has the propensity to grow if ignored. The shadow is dangerous, primitive, irrational, reeks of the public lavatory, the taboo. If collectively we don't pay it the attention it deserves, it could swallow up an entire epoch. This is the place where shame might be productively used. Carl Jung has written that shame is a soul-eating emotion, and it is that for sure, but in its corrosive capacity, it can completely hollow us out, so that in the empty space that's been cleared out, we have a greater capacity for empathy towards those around us. Connecting with that part of ourselves we hope others don't see is to begin to dissolve the very mindset that harbors that hope in the first place. In the process of learning to forgive ourselves, we can also forgive each other. Here I stand, your Keatsian example of negative capability. I've been a professor and a prisoner, a thief and a saint, a citizen and an anarchist, mentally gifted and mentally ill. Consciously and inadvertently, I've inflicted harm on other living creatures, and I've sacrificed myself completely for their well-being many times over. I've been your mother and you've been my daughter for so many lifetimes, all of us spinning together on this marvelous planet, orbiting a star in an unfathomable universe of stars. Let's actively, not abstractly, love each other and work to change this world we share to be a bit more magnanimous. For in such daily acts of connectedness, grace resounds more permanently than the sound of a judge's gavel against a wooden bench. It's a reverberation to ripple us awake. And so that's the final of the 6 letters that I write. And it comes right at the end, right before the epilogue of the book.
Yeah, that was a terrific reading. And that letter was particularly fascinating to me because it brought everything together. Now, I want, for my first question, though, to go back to the place in the book that is the most specific, the time you spent at Hartford Correctional Center, and the people you encountered there, and the sort of conflicts and friendships you made, and also the injunction by one of your fellow inmates, I think it was Chaos, who asked you to tell their stories because you had a privileged access to, the capacity to tell stories that he did not and no one else there did. And I wonder if you could say something about that, or tell us what the situation was, and the extent to which it was a motivating factor for writing this book.
Yeah, and Chaos, who I talk about, incidentally, was illiterate when I met him, and we worked together, and he actually wrote his first letters under my tutelage, which is a small but important pedagogical event in my life, I think. But yeah, I mean, I didn't, I was totally petrified when I first went. I didn't know what to expect. I wanted to disappear into the wall. And yet, because, and I detailed these 90 days that I had to do, which was stretched out over the course of about 1.5 years, which was a little bit of an unusual situation because I had a privately hired attorney. It allowed me to come out to teach summer school and to not interrupt my working schedule. Although in retrospect, it was one of those things that I wished I'd done all at one go, because every time you have to go through the humiliation of being objectified and turned into a carceral object and told to cough and spread your ass cheeks and given the prison tans and having to reintegrate with another different group of men was really traumatic and problematic. But that first stretch where I had to spend 45 days, and it was unlike anything I anticipated. I wasn't in a cell. I was in a dorm with 60 other men. You basically had bunk beds that you stayed on, and the little shape that 3 bunk beds made together was your cube. And so you mainly interacted with your cube mates. That was your kind of social circle in some sense. And because I found very little rehabilitation, very little time for any kind of self-improvement, therapy, anything like that. It was just passing time, trying to, and how do you do that? You can play cards, do push-ups, and then of course, tell stories, right?
Yeah.
Tell stories. And that was, I think, what allowed me kind of entry into these men's lives, is that they started talking, I started talking. And one of the things that I realized is, on the one hand, I had benefited immensely from systems of privilege and come from a very different world than many of the men, who I should say 95% of were men of color, or African-American or Hispanic American. And yet, by virtue of that fact, as one of the guys I met told me, he was like, oh, if your skin's darker than a grocery bag, this was when I had the stop and frisk in New York, you're one of us. And so there was a way in which I also could kind of relate to some of their sense of discrimination and being discriminated against. And when these men told me their stories, and many of which were heartbreaking, I mean, they were, these men were emotionally complicated, in some cases really pretty intelligent. In some cases, they had substance abuse issues or mental health problems, but none of those issues were being addressed in jail. And they made me promise that I would do something with these stories. I mean, and it came, and all of this is kind of in the course of the book, but they would come to find out, because I was being promoted to professor while I was finishing up these last of the 90 days. And it became this very public news in the state, that I had this kind of access and voice that they didn't. And they said, we've shared these things with you. Our life is meaningless. No one really cares about us, but you on the outside, people will listen to you. And so we want you to do something with what you've observed in here, with what we've told you about our lives. And I promised them the day before I got out that I would. And I knew as a writer that I would have to do something writerly with this material anyway. But I think when I had those conversations, I realized that I was going to have to turn it into a book, and probably not a book of poetry. It was going to have to be a very different kind of book, which was the inception of the memoir, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm kind of curious. This question popped up in my mind. I wasn't meaning to ask it, but I want to ask it now. Why did you decide to write a memoir rather than a novel, for example?
Hmm.
Were you thinking about this novelistically? Because it has so many, it's so rich novelistically. I mean, it's just,
Yeah, I mean, there were certainly moments along the way where I wish that I had maybe chosen a more novelistic approach. But given the circumstances of what happened, and the fact that my case, in which I had misdemeanors, and it was covered in the Hartford Courant, I think they wrote 7 or 8 articles about me. It was front page news, and I was on the local television shows in Connecticut. And much of that reporting was inaccurate or sensationalistic, but it was very much in the kind of consciousness that memoir would seem to speak to a lot better than a novel. I felt like I needed to reclaim my own story and to tell it. And I also felt like the impact that this experience had, I can't really unsee what I saw. And to turn it into fiction seemed like it would dilute it in some way. And I felt part of my compulsion, I guess, was to bear witness, having gone through this time, to try to be an accurate observer of what I experienced and what I saw. And it seemed like a nonfiction was really the place for that. And there also are these threads, which we can talk about, but I look a little bit at the history of mass incarceration, the kind of puritanical and Calvinist roots of the American criminal justice system. And all of those are almost a little journalistic, perhaps, in nature. And certainly that also was better suited to memoir.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting what you say about shame, right? Because, like your parents, I came from South India to America. I mean, a long time ago, and I was very small. I mean, in the Eisenhower era, but still, I sort of think of myself as your parents, I'm sure, think of themselves as an immigrant, however long ago it was, however young I was. And I remember India from family memory as essentially a culture of shame, right? As old world cultures are, shame provides the means by which to create order within communities. And, and I think it's interesting what you say about Puritanism. Certainly, Puritanism has a punitive aspect to it, but it also has a redemptive aspect to it, right? It has an aspect of grace. And that, and then once you've done your time, right, go thou and sin no more.
Right.
And that becomes kind of, you are washed clean by your punishment. Whereas in traditional cultures of shame, punishment seems to be endless. Yeah. And that's kind of an interesting thing that you're playing around with, because you are engaged in a narrative of redemption, right? In some way that you call it correctional rather than confessional, and you make that explicit. But in some sense, this is a confession by which you're purged and restored to status, to your place in society. And your place as a writer, which is your identifying mark in this society where people are so different from one another that their occupations identify them in very significant ways. Yeah. And I was wondering if you could say something about that.
And I think that we're meant to be in the Western world a guilt-based society, and I kind of tend to differentiate shame and guilt. I mean, if we think of Hester Prynne in The Scarlet Letter, she feels shame without guilt, whereas someone like Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment feels guilt without shame. Right. So the guilt differentiates between the doer and the deed in some way, and it offers a possibility of personal redemption through confession and subsequent action. Whereas shame there's no such relief. You did not do something wrong. You yourself are intrinsically wrong. I think what I want to look at a little bit is, though we're meant to be a guilt-based society, the Puritans, they believed in these sanguinary punishments of very public dunkings and pilloryings and brandings, and the Scarlet Letter is a great example. And that impulse never really has left, so that when you find people who have paid their debt to society and they have done their time, they're not restored or reintegrated into society. There's still this stigma that's attached to them that will kind of follow them, much like the Scarlet Letter in some way. And so I feel like the rhetoric we have about grace and does not really match up with the actuality of the circumstances of many of these men. What's interesting also is religious transgression and criminality were kind of conflated back in the day. The Calvinists, who believed in the predetermination of the elect, there was almost a sense that if you were born less privileged, more marginalized, as a person of color, it was a sign of God showing that you were not the chosen. But those, who were born with power, with money, it was kind of a sign of munificence on earth in some way. And I almost think that principle still exists very much when we look at the widening inequality that exists in American society. But yeah, guilt in my family, maybe the same as yours. It was very much, what would the aunties think over there, right? How it was this kind of sense of, you can be a certain way inside of the family unit, and yet outside in the world, you need to project this. And, when my mother would talk to her other family members, was always the mode of talking about your children was to kind of brag about them, right? And you would never talk about the things that you were ashamed of or embarrassed of, or that you had difficulty with. And I found wasn't really a language to access that experience as a young boy.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm very curious about that other thread in the book, which is India. And, not the aspects of India that you interpret, both in terms of your personal experience, and the fact that you go to ground there, that you go there in order to kind of restore a sense of your identity and a sense of your authenticity before you can go out into the world again. And in your darkest moments, you find yourself in India. And you paint those scenes very, very vividly, and it's interesting to me the way India as a subject, and India is a huge subject, and people, there's been a lot of kind of tackling of India in the context of trying to fit one civilization into another, which is what is one of the enterprises of this book too. And it's really interesting, and I was wondering about the motivation in that case too, the impulse to try to recover through the lens of this dramatic experience you had, the larger movements of your people from one civilization to another.
Yeah, and right at the book actually begins with me in India, kind of looking back on everything that's happened. And it just so happened that I was there. I got to spend some time with my grandmother, who's since passed away. And it also felt like it was so far. When I was in the midst of this, and oftentimes we dream of being in the news as a writer, getting some kind of notoriety and being on TV and in the newspapers. Of course, I was, for totally the wrong reason. And they sent camera trucks to my house, and there isn't a lot that happens in Connecticut. So it became very big news. And to escape that, being in India somehow in the midst of this ancient Vedic culture where, I would go to the temple with my uncle and eat thali off of a banana leaf. And it did feel like there was a way in which I was kind of reconnecting with my heritage, and it made everything that was happening in my life in Connecticut seem relatively minuscule, that the world itself was this vast place. I think part of what this book also does unintentionally is kind of puncture this whole model minority myth, which I certainly kind of labored under. I don't think there could, and I think my mother might actually be watching today. I'm not sure, but I'm deeply sorry for everything that happened, because there's nothing that could be more humiliating than to imagine that your firstborn son, who's been provided all of the benefits of a Ivy League education, would somehow end up in jail. And yet, I think that. One of the things was the exposure to these men who I never would have met at any point in my life, telling me these stories. And I guess the other thing that I was noticing in myself was that throughout my life, I had these two principles. One, which was this notion transmitted to me from my family of kind of Tamilian Brahmin exceptionalism. This idea that, when you're a vegetarian and you do the Gayatri Mantra and you have the sacred thread, that you are, though the caste system doesn't exist, there is this sense that, there's this purebred, not only a Brahmin, an Iyengar Brahmin, it is a very specific kind of purity. And at the same time, feeling when I was growing up in Northern Virginia, deeply marginalized, very much other, very much the only South Asian kid in Manassas, Virginia. And so, I think that I was kind of containing these two things of this idea of exceptionalism and marginalization. And somehow, in order to create my own identity or a space for my own sense of self, I nurtured, I think, this secret sensibility that was kind of neither Indian nor American, but that I wanted to be a space where I could kind of discover who I was, free of those constraints and pressures.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there is at the heart of the book, I think, a real strong sense you convey at moments that you don't know why you're doing what you're doing, that like the heart of the book is a sense of mystification at yourself, which you can construe, I think, in terms of South Asian experience, but you can also construe it in terms of existential experience, I mean, the book has certain elements where it brushes up against someone like Robert Bresson, if you know Pickpocket, that there's a fundamental compulsion there, that transcends anything like what we would call identity, right? Socially construed, racially construed in terms of economic privilege or lack thereof, that beyond all of those things, there is this confrontation with something incalculable about yourself, I mean, I think especially in the second episode, the Home Depot episode, where you've gone through this whole thing and then you relapse and then you're really mystified by who you are. And that's really, the kind of, that you peel back, to use the Vedantic image, the layers of the onion, right? And at the core, there's this nothingness that, you have to deal with finally. And that's a really interesting process in the book. As it meanders, it's also narrowing toward a point, toward that particular point.
Yeah, I think that was also part of my compulsion was this unraveling. I mean, they do in Sanskrit, they talk of drishti, this kind of dark cloud that can overcome your life in some way. And it's not that, of course, I'm endowed with free will and I made these stupid decisions, these reckless decisions. And, the rationale, as you said, was mystifying in some ways to me. I mean, I think I've always been a bit of an anarchist, but there was this almost a principle of self-sabotage that was operational at that time, and it wasn't really clear to me. It was almost a kind of a instinctual, oppositional, defiant disorder type of and that is really the moment where I have to kind of really take stock of where I am and to try to understand what I think. And I trace in the book was maybe a little seed that had been growing in me since I was a young boy, that I had just neglected, but that was always kind of there, almost a kind of dark matter of some kind.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it is a characteristic of people people who are immigrants or close to the immigrant experience, that there's a tremendous restlessness, right? There's a kind of, and that tends to be channeled. I mean, I don't think the model minority myth is a myth, but it's, one of those myths that have a large element of truth, simply because immigrants tend to have that restlessness and they channel that restlessness. I mean, I think Auden famously said about immigrants that they don't know what they want, but they know what they don't want,
Mm.
you know, and they're always trying to get away from what they don't want. And what they don't want is, like always creeping up on them in some way, and they can feel the presence of that.
Mm.
And, and I think that restlessness can take many, many forms if you can find a way to channel it into your work, of course, which is what most people do, then you're likely to be very successful in your work
Mm.
because there's an energy there. But that energy is going to be there wherever you channel it. It's going to force you into doing all sorts of things. And
And I think it's useful also just to mention that I think the model minority, I don't remember the name of the journalist, but it was invented by a Time journalist who was white. And there was a way in which it was meant to kind of mobilize this quote unquote more diligent, studious, quiet ethnicities against the ones that had deemed more troublesome and problematic. And that injected this kind of racial animus that didn't exist. It wasn't like South Asians got together and said, hey, look at us, we're the model minority. So there's a way in which, yeah.
yeah, yeah. But I think, I mean, I don't think anybody inside those communities, whether they're East Asian or South Asian, embraces that idea.
Mhm.
But in some sense, there are sociological categories and economic categories into which they kind of fall. I mean, even, and it's something that has become a part of politics, even though it was an invention, like the acronym WASP, right?
Uh-huh.
That didn't appear in the literature until the late 50s, early 60s. The people you call the Puritans, they didn't go around saying we're WASPs.
Yeah.
It was a way to kind of ethnicize that group,
Mm.
right? And give it characteristics and stuff like that. And of course, all of that is having very bad consequences in America now,
Yeah.
where you're getting a kind of ethnic fragmentation and balkanization, which is really,
Mm.
pretty distressing when you look at it closely.
Mm.
Which is why it's good not to look at it closely. But I mean, in some sense, it does seem to me that there's a kind of a quality in which there's a real continuity of your ambition throughout all of this, right? I mean, you were actually writing and reading when you were in prison. You were actually thinking of yourself, obviously, as a writer while you were still there. And this was another experience that you were assimilating into your ambition. You know, that seemed very clear to me in the passages that were taking place, you know, in the correctional center, that you had not at all let go of your vocation in some way, that you hadn't been crushed to the point where you didn't know who you were. You knew exactly who you were. You were a writer and you were going to write about this.
Oh, it was actually, that was something that I needed to cling to and to survive in some sense. I mean, I initially kind of envisioned myself a immersion journalist, kind of parachuted into this space and looking around, and I filled notebook after notebook, and any book I found, really any text, was a kind of life raft. I would read bureaucratic forms and overhear dialogue between men, just write down different slang words, and the odors and sensory detail of I didn't want to forget any of it, but I also felt like that was, yes, I was a writer, but I needed to kind of do something with this experience in order to transform it for myself, in order to move forward, and kind of to make sense of what I was experiencing and seeing. Now, I think a lot of my ideas about this space were through popular culture shows, Prison Break and Oz, and of course what I was experiencing was really very different. I guess, yeah, I mean, the idea that I was going to write a book about it, as soon as I knew that I had to do this time, I knew I was going to have to do something in a literary sense with the material.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's some questions, Ravi. Do you want to take a couple of questions?
Sure.
A couple of people are asking you to read some more.
Okay.
So maybe we can take some questions and then you can close out
Yeah.
the reading with the event with another reading, a reading of a selection.
Definitely.
Yeah. Okay. Anonymous attendee asks, Ravi, thank you so much for reading tonight. I was wondering if you could talk more about the genesis of your 6 letters. The epigraph from Emily Dickinson, a poet who often framed her poems as missives, opens up so many possibilities. Did you think of the letters as poem-like?
Yes. I mean, those 6 letters, I felt like, the thing about a book is that memoir or any novel is a very deeply collaborative process. And so I felt like there was a way in which in the early drafts, I was kind of a fly on the wall. I was observing, but I wasn't really integrating myself and my voice as fully as I could. And this book is a means. I mean, it's called Correctional, so it's a means of trying to make amends with people who I might have hurt. And it was really in conversation with my partner Julie, kind of at the very end. And I'd also been reading Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, which is framed as an epistolary note to his young son. I thought introducing these letters is a way for me to kind of speak directly to people, but also add an intimate voice. And I did very much think of that as a different narrative thread. Maybe not a poem exactly, but I think some of the letters are pretty lyrical. I do use the entire book begins with a Ralph Ellison quote, and there are, authors and writers threaded throughout the book. But yeah, the epistolary nature of that was meant to, because the book also moves around in time and space kind of chronologically. And one of the things that I did to pass time, of course, when I was sitting on my bunk, was to write letters. I wrote letters to my friends, to my loved ones, and I would anticipate the letters that I would receive. And so it felt like, okay, using that form in some way makes a lot of sense to the story I want to tell.
Interesting. Yeah. Another question from Ralph Nazareth. Ravi, did you and your cube mates ever get beyond talking about the carceral experience?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think I detail some of these conversations, but we would talk about everything from our children. Of course, I was initially very hesitant to reveal anything too personal about me. I don't know these men. I was frankly kind of afraid of them. I was afraid initially if they found out that I was, a professor, that it would inject this element of class into these proceedings. But you can't help but, as you're talking, start talking about some of your experiences. And, most of the men kind of ended up telling me about their charges. Most of them, claimed innocence, whether it's true or not. I write in here that I felt like my bullshit detector was broken when I was in there because I couldn't really tell. But yeah, some of the stories like Chaos, when he told me about growing up, he lived in his uncle's Buick for a winter with the beer cans in the back of the car, and had been kicked out of his house. And, heartbreaking stories. Many other people who had parents themselves who had been incarcerated, so they had to be raised on their own or with a grandparent. And it just made me realize the kind of generational damage that is caused by this system that is frankly not very effective. In fact, is ineffective if you look at the rates of recidivism in the US compared to any other kind of G5, any other country.
Sure.
And, the quote that I use is that 25% of the world's prisoners are American, whereas we are 5% of the world's population, right? So, yeah, I did feel like the ways in which we connected things like music, food, family, and then all of them would have uh, ideas of how they could, what they would do when they got out. Some of them wanted to sue the state, and others had lavish meals that they conjured that they would do when they got out. And so, yeah, I think I did, especially these men in my cube, Lenny, Chaos, this guy, Junkie John, Domo. These guys, I got to know pretty well, because when you're sitting around all day, not having anything to do except to kind of talk, you end up getting to know each other.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Following up on that, Jessica Hall wants to know if you're still in touch with any members of your cube or with any of the other people you knew
Yeah, I have tried to, it's the numbers that I was given for Lenny, this Vietnam vet, gave me the number for his son. He wanted me to call him when I got out, and I tried to, and it was not a working number. I wrote a couple of letters to the men that I know with their, because I know their inmate numbers, but I never heard back. Based on my experience, I can't even really be confident necessarily that they would have received the letters. Some of these men were what arbitrarily and periodically moved from one facility to another. They move upstate, move back downstate. And so I would love to get a copy of this book in the hands of some of these guys, because to me, it's, I made this promise and I fulfilled it, and I have written this book, and I would like you to see it, but so far I have not had any success.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Should we take one more question and then have you read?
Sure.
No. Anonymous attendee has like one question that's a bunch of questions, and I'm going to pick one of them out. Now, was there ever a moment when you felt as though you shouldn't publish this book?
Yeah, I think I struggled with it a lot. I certainly had resistance from my family. My mother still, I think, can't really quite understand why, having gone through this really difficult time, I would cast a spotlight on the experience again. The general response is to repress, very, very deep, anything traumatic or problematic. And then also, it was different terrain for me when you write a memoir, writing about people in your life, some of whom don't want to be written about, some of whom who object to your representation of them. I had to kind of write about some of my colleagues in Connecticut, and some of the newspapermen, and it felt like God, I'm really am, and I attempted to be as honest as possible and to take ownership for the mistakes that I made, and there were moments where I still am a little bit terrified as to what the response will be, but ultimately I felt like this is a story that I needed to share. But yeah, I definitely, there were moments, and there was one stretch where I put the book aside for almost a year, and I didn't know if I could get back into it. I'd shown it to a few readers, and the response was that I was still a little defensive and embittered, and I didn't know if I could get the right tone. I mean, I want it to be both kind of commercially readable to a wide audience, but also to have a certain kind of literary and intellectual quality. And kind of synthesizing those two impulses was pretty difficult as well.
Mhm, mhm. And to follow up on that question, I'm interested, did you sit down with your family and tell them this book is coming out? Did you have frank discussions with them? For example, with your daughters who are now teenagers, right? And
Yes, well, I did. This was, almost a decade ago, and so Samara at that time was young enough to know what was happening, and my ex and I decided to tell her about it, to frame it as a teachable moment. And so I had talked to her about it, and of course, I think she must have been 7 or 8. She went and told the other kids on the playground, "Oh, guess what? Guess where Daddy's going." So and it was a very small town that they still live in, actually. And yes, I mean, before the final draft of this, I sent a copy of the book out to everyone that's in it, to my family, to my ex, and I heard from some of them, and I did not hear from some of them. My mother really did a great job of copy editing some of my mistakes when it came to some of the locations and dates, and some of the relationships to some of her Indian relatives and the like. So it was very valuable to have her insight. I don't know ultimately if is pleased, but yeah, I think that she is, actually. But yeah, I did show the book to everyone that's in it.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it strikes me very much that it is, a book that binds up a lot of wounds, and you know, and sort of closes a lot of things that needed to be looked at. And I think there's something. I used the word redemptive earlier, and it does feel really redemptive reading it, and seeing all of its elements and how they come into play, and how you kind of, the word you used, honesty, is, I think, a really appropriate one. It's a very honest book.
Well, and I have to say, Vijay, I mean, we've known each other for a while, and you were a pretty constant presence in a lot of ways while I was going through this. I mean, one of the tragic things in some ways is that I lost touch with a lot of people I was very close to. It was a bit of a litmus test as to who your true friends are, where does loyalty lay? And there were people I thought I would be friends with for the rest of my life who I don't talk to this day. And it was almost the taint of what happened to me impacted our relationship in some way, which was unfortunate.
Yeah, 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 yeah. That's unfortunate. Yeah, it's interesting. So yeah, I think we've got 4 minutes. So
Okay.
maybe, we could close it out with an excerpt from you.
I'll read a little excerpt, and it is anonymous. Says, yes, I am. I'm teaching creative nonfiction and journalism at Tufts, and also for the New York Writers Workshop, which is having an event in Athens, and if we can all travel in the fall. So I'll read just a little bit at the end of this chapter, where I am actually in jail, and this is the end of At Long Last Whiplash, right before I'm able to get out. Looking around the dorm, I meditate on beauty and commerce, Here are men jettisoned as criminal, hunched over a pad to draw a unicorn with colored pencils, or partitioning their living space into more comfortable quarters by turning empty toilet paper rolls into eyeglass holders or saltine boxes into cupboards, twisting strips of garbage bags into a laundry line on which to dry their socks. Good design applies not just to merchandise, but to our social institutions as well. How much better would this jail function if these men were able to improve themselves by building workplace skills or speaking to a psychological counselor? Why is the ratio something like 20 COs for every one mental health worker? How does good design interface with rehabilitation? Then, waiting it into being, I have one night and one wake up to go. The Cube has a new infusion of arrivals, and rumor has it that the gymnasium floor is more crowded than it has ever been. I begin giving away my possessions. I give Junkie John some bagels and cheesy beans. I give Whoopi my playing cards. I give Tattoo, much to his displeasure, for he wanted something more, my coffee cup. I give Leonard the rest of my pad of paper and my pen. I give Obama my Softy 3-in-1 conditioning shampoo. I give Chaos my chessboard and my radio, and I'm afraid that he might kiss me. The only things I keep are my notebook, the letters I've received, and the commissary envelopes that have actual postage on them so that I can use them on the outside. Domo won't accept anything from me because to do so would be an admission that he might have to come back here after court. You must be clowning, India, he booms when I try to offer him my shower shoes. I'm soaring with you. We free birds flap our wings and flying free. No coming back for you and me. Ever discerning Chaos noticed that Domo has refused my shoes and comes along around with a hangdog look of desperation on his face in the hope I will give them to him instead. Yo, Professor, I'll take them shoes. I'm sure he will. Plus, remember, I'm getting you a going away present. Don't forget about us when we're out of here. I smile. How could I ever forget you, Chaos? No, I'm serious. Real talk. You're the only one in here who can tell our stories. Chaos has moved from his bunk to sit on Lenny's pillow. To sit where someone lays their head is cause to fight. So I'm thankful that Lenny is away at medical. People, they be listening to you. I've been opening my mouth all my life, but no one's ever hear me. But you're different. You can tell the world how we caged up like animals, how those COs don't do jack, how we can't get on with our lives even after we done our time. His face shines with torment, his gap-toothed mouth drawn in a half scowl, half despair. I done told you ain't nothing but a piece of trash, but my daughter ain't. Aaliyah beautiful. She's half white. She's got a chance, but only if this world changes. You hear? I'm a piece of garbage. I want to get out of here and keep slinging that rock. Still rip your granny's earrings out of her ear for a quick fix. Don't know no other way. I tried to go straight, work construction, work real hard till my fingers bled. But once they found out about my record, I'm done every time. And I end up back in here. Chaos has started to tear up. Promise me, Professor, he blinks hard. Promise me you'll tell our stories. I promise, Kendrick. He puts out his fist to be bumped. When I meet his eye again, the amazing protean capacity of his visage is on full display because there's no longer a lingering trace of sorrow, but rather the intensity of a crow's sly hunger, and he's hopped back on his feet. Now watch me work. Slipping over into the high side, the other half of the dorm where he's not supposed to be. Domo and I stay up that last night, laughing, sharing stories of girls and stupid pranks we pulled, talking about food and music, making plans to meet up in Hartford, though I doubt either of us really thinks it's going to happen. Lenny usually lies at night with his t-shirt over his face, and when the noise level increases, curses at everyone under his breath. Tonight, he stays up to join the conversation. I'll miss you, Lenny says earnestly. I hope I won't get killed with you gone. He looks truly despondent. I pat his shoulder, promises him that I'll reach his son when I get out. The phone number he provided me was a non-working number, and promise him that he'll soon be out, seeing his father before he knows it. I swap names and inmate numbers with a few other guys in the dorm and then finally drift off. I'm too agitated to sleep, and by the time wake up comes at 5:30, I've already showered. I'm waiting in the day room with my few remaining possessions bundled in a garbage bag. I shaved the night before with a terrible one-blade razor in cold water, and my chin has scabbed over. I wait with Domo and a couple of other guys for the call, and goes on from there.
Wow, that's great. Thank you.
Well, thank you both so much. I'll step in here. That is all we have time for this evening. But yeah, I don't know if you guys have any closing remarks, or we just want to end it there before we wrap up.
I will just reiterate my thanks to you, Kate, and to Harvard Bookstore. And I do hope support your indie bookstore. So if you're going to buy this book or one of Vijay's books, do it through Harvard Bookstore.
All right. Great.
Yes, and I've put in the chat the link to pre-order the book. I misspoke earlier. I realized the pub date was pushed back a tiny bit, but I provided links in the chat. I spammed you all with them. So I really hope everyone gets the chance to read this. So yeah, thank you tremendously to Ravi and Vijay for sharing this time and this really thoughtful conversation with us that spanned culture and our justice system and trauma and empathy and so much more. It was really incredible to hear. And thank you to everyone out there at home for spending your evening with us. So on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, have a great night. Please keep reading and please be well. Thank you.
Thank you all. Stay safe.